honored committee, dear colleagues, beste vrienden, familie. In the next 10 minutes, I'd like to give you an overview of the research I've been working on in the last 5 years. We all noticed this summer, droughts are an actual and global problem. Europe, as well as the US, China, and the Horn of Africa have been facing extraordinary dry months. So which continents do you think are going to be the next? While droughts can occur everywhere, they have the most impact in more arid and agricultural regions, like the Horn of Africa, where multiple consecutive months of failed rains have caused famine situations. And so for my PhD, I wanted to investigate how it is possible that regions that face droughts so often are still quite vulnerable to it. And I wanted to investigate if I can include these vulnerability dynamics in disaster risk models. But analyzing and modeling drought risk is an academic challenge because drought risk is intertwined with human actions. People can take water from rivers, adding it to the fields through irrigation, and water is actually directly affecting people's incomes and health. So how can we put this complex human water system in a drought risk model? I argue that we can do this by giving humans a more central role in the often quite physical-based models. And that is exactly what agent-based models do, the technique that I applied. There, the decisions of humans and their interactions with their environment and with each other play a major role. Over the past 5 years, I've been building such an agent-based model. My model can represent the changes in drought risk for smallholder farmers in Kitui in Southeast Kenya. And I made sure that the adaptations that these farmers can make are explicitly included in this model. So what information do you need if you want to create an agent-based model? I wanted to know why and how people make decisions about adaptation measures. And to answer this, I conducted a survey with smallholder farmers in Kitui, and I discussed this issue with stakeholders, with Kenyan scientists, and with African policymakers. And I compared this information with theory on economic and psychological behavior in order to be able to frame my findings. Then I wanted to make humans central in my model, so I had to make a profile of them. However, I found that farming families in Kitui are quite diverse. And so in what's next, I'll tell you the story about Munyao and Kambua, two farm families that are very different from each other. For example, Kambua is older than Munyao, and they also are different in terms of literacy, in family size, farm size, and in terms of wealth. You can already imagine that these two farming families make different decisions. In my model, I look at 4 adaptation measures the farmers can take. First of all, you have the Fanyaju terraces, which reduces runoff from the fields. You have the mulching technique to protect the fields from the sun. You have shallow wells to have access to water, and you have irrigation infrastructure. And so I wanted to investigate and model how people decide how to adopt these measures. And many models assume that people do this based on purely economic rational terms with full information. But I found that perceptions play quite a large role. For example, their perception about how severe the drought risk is, what is their fear in terms of towards the droughts, is quite important to motivate them to adopt these measures. Also, their perceptions about the costs of these measures and their perception about how well these measures actually work play a major role. Lastly, also, people's confidence in themselves, their self-efficacy, how well do they think they can actually do something about the issue, plays a role in their motivation to adopt a new adaptation measure. You can imagine that these perceptions are different for the family of Kambua and Munyao, my two example farmers. And you can imagine that these perceptions can change over time. I'll explain that by linking the observed rainfall conditions of the past 10 years with potential drought impact and the motivations of these farmers. For example, Munyao actually has already installed a measure on his fields, and during a drought year, he will maybe not face any impact, while Kambua faces a reduction in her yields and a food insecure situation. Another year, 2 consecutive dry years, even Munyao feels something. He has a reduction in yield, loses income, and his fear for droughts increases. This motivates him to adopt a new measure. Kambua, however, has 2 failed seasons food insecure situation, and she loses her self-confidence, her trust in herself that she can do anything against it, so she doesn't adopt a new measure. Another year, another drought, Gamboa is again affected. And both farmers see that having measures on the field that actually works, so their confidence or their perception about how these measures work increases. Munyao would like to take a new measure, but doesn't know any new measures. Gamboa, however, learns from Munyao how to adopt the mulching technique, so she installs it. Now imagine in the next year, the government decides to apply farm trainings, explaining them about new techniques. This new knowledge allows Munyao to adopt a new technique. However, this knowledge doesn't affect Gamboa in the same way, because after many dry years, she doesn't have the financial capacity anymore to install a new measure. A similar story in the next 2 consecutive dry years. Gamboa actually ends up in a poverty trap. By being affected year after year, she cannot build a financial capital to invest in new measures, so she will be affected by the next droughts as well. Now, a few years where there is plenty of rain will actually lower people's perception about the drought risk, their awareness of how severe the situation is. But again, the government can do something against this. If they send out a warning when the drought is predicted and they make sure everyone receives this warning, then people's awareness is raised. In this case, Munyao could adopt a new measure. If they combine this warning with financial aids to the poorest farmers, then even Gamboa would be able to take a new measure and prepare herself for the upcoming drought. Now, how does this story relate to the model that I created? My model simulates these stories, but plenty of others as well, so I can evaluate the risk for individuals as well as for a full farming community. And so here you see the numbers of measures that the farmers have adopted for 3 scenarios. The first scenario is a reactive government that does not take any action, and you can see that the number of adopted measures stays quite low. Then you have a proactive government that prepares the farmers for upcoming droughts by sending out warnings. You can see that increases the number of adopted measures. Lastly, you can see the prospective government. That is a government who takes these proactive actions, but also invests in generally vulnerability reducing measures, such as education and such as access to the markets. And you can see this has the biggest effect on the number of adopted measures. And that also has an effect on the crop yield, on the food security situation. This figure shows the yearly crop harvest, which is of course influenced by yearly rainfall conditions. But you can see that this prospective government's action results in higher yields overall, at least after a few years. Finally, we can also evaluate how these yields evolve under climate change. And if we would have this situation in a drier and a hotter climate, we can see that the yields, the farming harvests, are actually lower, even under the prospective government scenario. So my model can evaluate drought risk under both governmental actions and climate change. And what you can see on the graph here is the change in emergency needs, the need for financial aids. And I was able to demonstrate that only under the prospective government scenario, we can reduce the need for financial aid under all types of evaluated climate change scenarios. So in my research, I showed how adaptation dynamics can, in the context of droughts, can be included in risk models. And I improved the understanding of decision maker of smallholder farmers. And I'm convinced that this is the way forward for making new drought risk models. Besides, my work can also be used by NGOs and governments to allow them to better target their actions, to make sure they are tailored to the needs of the people, which is desperately needed if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Lastly, I would love to validate my model together with the people that I spoke with in Kitui to make sure that we evaluate the right scenarios, to make sure that they recognize themselves in these models. And finally, it would be great to also scale up my model, not only evaluating the context in Kitui, but also in all of Kenya or even the Horn of Africa, which is highly relevant to avoid a crisis such as the famine that is looming in Eastern Africa today. Thank you for listening.